Welcome back to the MovieBabble podcast. This week you've got myself, Colin, and I'm joined by Spencer as we talk about the DCEU. So the universe is coming to an end here with the release of Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. We're here to talk about some highs and lows, winners and losers, some of our favorite moments, and a few takeaways that we can kind of gather from the industry and this franchise as a whole. So remember, you can always check us out online at moviebabble.com and enjoy this week's episode of the MovieBabble podcast. it's it's such a weird universe that started off as just kind of something that was trying to keep the good vibes from the Dark Knight trilogy going, and I have suspicions that they were hoping that Christian Bale would somehow wrap into it somehow, because
hmm
a lot of the imagery and like the actual logos and stuff from the Dark Knight trilogy made it into Man of Steel and then got washed away. But it's just become such a weird train wreck of trying to imitate Marvel and then trying to do its own thing in too extreme of a direction, and then becoming the shill for HBO Max and then Max and whatever it will be called after Max, Max plus Discovery. It's just such a strange 10 years it's been watching this explode and implode at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was a point where if you would have asked me about doing this podcast, I would have had like much different feelings than I do right now. Like I'm thinking of the time in probably like 2016, 2017 when the MCU was like on top of the world and superhero movies were like not super grating or uninteresting, like kind of how they've been the past few years. And now I kind of like look back on the DCEU as kind of like this really it's a mess, kind of like we've alluded to, but it's also kind of interesting and endearing in kind of a weird way to me, just because it's had so many different directions and so many hands on the steering wheel that it just like it truly I think is going to be looked back on as one of the most bizarre and baffling times in comic book history.
Yeah, it is just it's so weird.
Yeah.
Uh, but with that, I think let's go ahead and dive into our bottom three rankings. So the way this will work is we'll work from third from the bottom on down, and we'll just go kind of round robin it. I'll go ahead and tee us off. So with great applause, I will introduce my bottom three, which I don't think this is going to be too distinct from what the internet probably thinks the bottom three are. As we were putting this together, I had some very mixed thoughts on a few of these, but my third from the bottom is the 2017 Justice League. That is the Joss Whedon version, and I'll start with the fact that I spent my literal last dollar on this movie. Way back in 2017, I was very financially irresponsible, and ended up having much less money in my bank account than I thought I did. And the night before I realized that all happened, I went to go see Justice League. I splurged, got the collector's cup, for Superman,
Yeah, of
and
course.
woke up the next morning and realized I had spent my actual last dollar, and that this movie had sent me into the negatives. So that's my first impression of Justice League. I think I've seen it maybe once since then, and then whenever the Snyder Cut came out, I watched that again. But depending on who you ask, that's a different movie. But yeah, I'm gonna put Justice League, the Justice League cut, firmly at third
Yeah.
from the bottom.
Yeah. I was gonna say the Justice League, as I think the Snyder Army calls it, is, the Justice League. So I actually also had Justice League 2017, but I had an honorable mention that I'll put as my third from the bottom just to make it a little bit different. So my third from the bottom is gonna be The Flash, which is obviously the most recent as of now DCEU, as we're recording this just right before Aquaman, The Lost Kingdom. I think it's good. Is it The Lost Kingdom? Yeah, just
Yeah,
before that hits theaters. Um, yeah, The Flash is It's a bad movie. Like, I don't really know what else to say. Like, I walked in, I guess, kind of with my expectations a little bit all over the place because I'd heard some people say, "Oh, this isn't near as bad as I expected it to be," and "Oh, Michael Keaton is in this movie," and all these kind of conflicting reports on the movie, and I thought the movie was awful, and it felt like it went on for way too long. The third act of this is maybe my least favorite third act in any of these movies. It's just a mess, and I did not think there was really anything good about the movie. So yeah.
Well, I personally hope you're not tired of talking about the Flash because it does appear here pretty soon on my list.
Okay.
So we'll go with number two. No need to dwell on the least favorites for too long. So I worked at the movie theater when my second from the bottom came out, and I don't know if you remember the golden year of 2016, but the hype for this
Yeah.
movie was pretty insane. Will
Mm-hmm.
Smith had kind of started making a resurgence after I. I'm gonna say I don't think Will Smith's career has ever fully like dipped in a complete this guy's obscure sense, but had not really done anything that was a massive hit in a while since I Am Legend and Pursuit of Happiness. Like Will Smith was back, he was on the cast list for this movie that hasn't given it away already. But the hype for this was pretty insane. Like people were excited for this movie. I was excited to see Killer Croc brought to life for the first time, which soon became a severe disappointment. But
Yeah,
people were
you were
going nuts
happy, huh?
people were going nuts for Harley Quinn. Like the hype for this movie was everywhere, and that is Suicide Squad, not the Suicide
Mm-hmm.
Squad, just regular Suicide Squad. And I feel like what happened with this movie, like the problems that David Ayer had and the studio ripping control, has been pretty well documented. But even in 2016, when this came out, and I was not nearly the cinephile that I am today, meaning I pretty much still only watched like big budget Disney properties. But even then, I could tell, I was like, some executive in 2014 saw Guardians of the Galaxy and was like, wait, we have to do that. And so they took whatever the original intention for Suicide Squad was, they ripped it up and put it to a bunch of pop music and somewhat retro covers. And we're like, here we go. We have Guardians of the Galaxy. I think on my blog at the time, my review of it was like Suicide of the Squadixy or something like that, just because it feels so much like such a poor accountant's interpretation of Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah, this is my worst movie of of the DCEU by far. Like, I don't think anything comes close, and it comes down to this is barely a movie. I'll just talk about it now, I guess. Yeah, it's oh dear. I saw this movie once in theaters, and I like had I have a cousin who was like, I think he was like 10 or 11 at the time. So it's like the perfect age for this type of a movie. And we were like, I would have walked out probably had he not been there because I hated this movie so much. And when we were walking out, I was like, "Oh, so what'd you think of the movie? Did you like it?" Because I wasn't gonna just rip into the movie just in case he liked it. And he was like, "I didn't really like it." And I was like, "Oh, okay. If it's not appealing to like a 10-year-old, then this movie's just a complete and utter failure." Um, yeah, there's so much about this movie that is so baffling. None of it makes any sense. It's just a mess. Like I don't know any other way to say it. And like you said, it reeks of studio interference. But even then, I don't think David Ayer is like the right filmmaker for this type of a property. Just judging off of his other work, you have things like Fury and Sabotage, and he's going to make this movie that's supposed to be this kind of wacky and kind of goofy tone, like comic book tone, and he just like didn't seem like the right filmmaker, the right fit for it. So, yeah, I agree with you. This is a terrible movie. It's one of the worst blockbusters of the 2010s, I would say. So that's where I
High
land.
praise.
Yeah.
So if that was your number one, you want to go ahead and do your number two, and then we'll head
Yeah,
into
and
number one.
it was kind of a a like push-pull between this and the Suicide Squad because I really dislike this movie. But my number two is going to be Man of Steel, um, which I want to start by saying Zack Snyder seems like a really like cool person. Like from what I've read about him, he seems like a decent guy. That said, his movies really don't work for me. This was kind of he like what people don't really remember, I guess, is that he was like a pretty uh people liked him at this point when he signed on to do Superman for Man of Steel, even though he kind of did Sucker Punch. Kind of the air around that movie was people being like, "Oh, he missed this time, but he'll probably come back and like knock it out of the park with Superman." And what it comes down to, the reason why I dislike this movie so much is I just hate his interpretation, his approach to this character. Like it feels completely wrong to me. Like the between this and Batman v Superman, there's like this, oh, Superman is this alien, he's something that we need to fear. Like there's all this really weird crazy type of like there's a crazy approach to this character where he's not something that you aspire to, he's something that you look up in the sky in fear of. And like he's snapping Zod's neck at the end of Man of Steel, and he's just like this really cold and distant character to me, where Superman, the Christopher Reeves ones back in like, the 70s and 80s, it was like when Superman was a like he's like the best of us, and he's this character who is meant to be something that we like aspire to be. And yeah, just Zack Snyder's approach and making it so dark and upsetting, and having, Pa can't like be like, oh, people will be scared of you if you like reveal yourself to everyone else. It just totally, every choice he makes in the movie, I feel like is the wrong one for me, for my taste with Superman. I know there are people who defend and like this movie a lot, but I really don't like this movie.
Yeah, I like Zack Snyder a lot more when he's just playing in his own sandbox full of things he made up. Like I think Rebel Moon, I'm excited to watch it even if I don't love it.
Same.
I think
Same.
Army of the Dead did a lot of really interesting things with that
Yeah.
genre. Um,
Yeah.
Still like didn't love it, but I'd put it far above here. And even within the DC universe, I'm not gonna. It's not in either my top three or my bottom three. But I think Batman versus Superman is a far more interesting movie than most of the things that have come out in the genre, even if
I
it's
agree with that.
horribly flawed. Like
Yes.
it's,
Yes. It's bad, but
I don't think it's
yeah.
a good movie, but it is an interesting movie, and at least
Yes.
it's trying to chew off a lot, and that's why I have it pretty significantly higher than even Man of Steel.
Hmm. Yeah, that like I kind of thought at first, is Batman versus Superman belong in this spot, but then I was like, no, because that movie at least like does stuff. It tries stuff that's like kind of like you said. For me, it doesn't work in most instances, but it's like trying to do things that are different and kind of kind of fascinating. Like when you think back on it. So yeah,
So my bottom worst DCU movie that I kind of already spoiled is going to be The Flash. I this was the kind of movie that as soon as it started, I was like just checking my watch. I was like, how long left? How long left? How long left? And it was like I had
and the
seen some of
answer
the
was always 1 hour.
I had seen the early reactions, and I was like, it can't be that bad. And then it's just the scene with the babies in the CGI, like the CGI. You can say it's stylistic all you want. It was really bad, and it was also just nonsensical CG in certain degree. Like I couldn't really tell like what Flash's super speed was actually helping him accomplish, and it's just a mess. And they were like, Supergirl is in this movie. I completely forgot Supergirl was in this movie because she shows up for
Oh,
about two
same.
scenes, and then she just gets her shit rocked by a CGI Michael Shannon over and over again. And even Michael Keaton coming back as Bruce Wayne, like I understand that's the big selling point of the movie, but like he's just an old guy in a bat suit. It was kind of funny watching. Like my favorite parts of this movie were watching his like 1980s Tim Burton tech interact with the world of Man of Steel and watching him like monkey crawl around some Kryptonians. But other than that, it's not good. And then it ends in just this horrible blur of AI faces
Oh,
that creates nostalgia for things that didn't even exist. Like when
yeah,
I was offended when George Reeves and Christopher Reeves show up because I'm like, come on, they're
dude.
dead. We're gonna AI their faces. And then
Yeah.
when Nicolas Cage comes out, I'm like, this isn't even real. This doesn't exist. This isn't something anyone can have nostalgia for because it's not real.
Yeah. Honestly, there was a point in The Flash in that clusterfuck of CGI at the end there that like I honestly thought that like I had died and went to hell. Like I was in the seventh circle of hell or something along those lines because me and you have kind of often with this wave of nostalgic superhero movies that we're in the midst of with like the multiverse stuff and all of that, we've messaged each other and like kind of complain like old grumpy men about how like how just like disconnected we feel from this like hype train of nostalgia that people have. But in the Flash, like I actually, it like hit a low I never thought we would be unfortunate enough to see like in superhero films.
Yeah, that sequence made me wish that Teller's calculations had been correct and the Trinity test had ignited the atmosphere. I was like, total destruction would have been worth it if it meant no one ever saw this.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really bad. Like I agree with you. This it's just, oh, yeah. I don't like to think about it honestly.
Well, with that, would you like to get slightly more optimistic and tackle the top three?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of where I kind of might be breaking some rules, so I'm gonna have to maybe have you rein me in. But do you want me to start with my number three?
Yeah, if you want, go ahead
Okay.
and start with three, and we'll work our way up.
And depending, this could be my number one. So, my number three is The Suicide Squad, the 2021 film by James Gunn. Um, so complete opposite. Like we have a Suicide Squad on each end of the spectrum for me, at the very top and at the very bottom. And it just comes down to this is how it looks when you do it right. Um, this movie really leans into its R rating, which I really respected. I like the characters. I thought the cast was great. It felt like the people who were wasted before, like Joel Kinnaman, for example, is like used really well in this movie, and I really liked him, which made me realize he's actually a pretty solid and charismatic actor, which the first film most certainly did not. Um, but on top of that, I think that there's a lot of really clever and interesting set pieces. I love I love the opening scene that sets up like, oh, there's this group who's basically the cannon fodder who we send in, and they're the actual like Suicide Squad out of the group. And it's just like any movie that opens with Pete Davidson getting his face like blown off and then everybody else like just dying horribly is something I'm into. Yeah, it has James Gunn signature like kind of, oh, this is a movie about misfits who are like learning to communicate with each other and work as a team. And I really, really love this movie. I think it's an awesome movie.
I agree with you. I have it a little bit higher up, so I'm gonna jump into my number three and then circle back to it.
Okay.
So for my number three, I have a runner up which I didn't count, and then an actual number three. So I'm gonna
Okay.
plug Blue Beetle because I don't really know. They're very vague on whether or not that's actually a part of this universe or the next one. I enjoyed it.
Hmm.
It gets an honorable mention. But my actual number three is going to be the 2019 Shazam, and I think
Okay.
I like this movie. I don't love this movie. I think it really was the first DCEU movie to have heart. I'll take that back. There's another movie that came out a little bit sooner. Trying to get my timeline in order, but it's one of the few DCEU movies to really have heart and really have an actual human character at the center of its story. And I think emotionally it hits a lot of its beats well. When I was a wee lad and you could still call Shazam Captain Marvel, he was my favorite DCEU or DC at that time superhero.
Mm.
And so it was really cool to see him brought to life on the big screen. I used to watch the reruns of the 1970s or 1980s show with my dad. So I was like, cool, we could go see Captain Marvel and Rock of Eternity and all that fun stuff. So it was nice to see him brought to the big screen, and I enjoyed Zachary Levi and Chuck, so I was like excited to see him not be fodder like he was in the Marvel universe. And I think he does a really good job with what he's given in this movie, somewhat in the sequel, but not nearly as much. And I like it. I think Billy Batson has a really good story as far as the DC universe goes. The villain isn't too memorable, but Mark Strong is going to do his best with whatever he gets, and I think he absolutely did so here. And I think just having like straight up demons be the enemies was a pretty cool
Yeah.
thing that you don't get a lot in superhero movies.
Yeah, it kind of I heard somebody say that it has like the Joe Dante film vibes, like Gremlins, and those movies that kind of like that I grew up with personally, where it's like it's not afraid to be a little bit more kind of dark and crazy. So yeah, Shazam's a fun movie. I did like Shazam. So
If you say it
um
one more time, he appears.
yeah. So moving on to my number two. This is where I kind of start maybe stretching the rules a little bit. My number two is Peacemaker, which is actually a series, the HBO series. Um, it's kind of a continuation of the Suicide Squad, obviously, because it features one of the main characters played by John Cena. And this show is awesome. It's one of my favorite superhero things that's ever come out. Like it's so it's so interesting. It continues that tone of the Suicide Squad that's incredibly dark but also very funny. It has the best opening credit scene like of anything ever. It's so good. And it's just all around a really really entertaining and fun time to watch. So, I love it. Peacemaker.
Yeah, I hadn't considered TV shows as a ranking in the list, but I like it. I would probably put it up in my top three or at least top four had I, thought about that beforehand. But
Well, it's not going to stop there. I'm warning you.
I did put something starring Peacemaker as my number two, and that is
Okay.
the Suicide Squad. Don't forget the.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's really kind of fun that James Gunn and Zack Snyder are the defining entities behind this franchise because they kind of came up together. Dawn of the Dead, the 2004 was kind of both of their big starts, so I think it's kind of funny that Zack launched this version of the franchise and James Gunn kind of jumped in and is gonna launch or relaunch or retool whatever the next phase is. But I really like
Hmm.
this movie. It took I think it really perfected the idea of Suicide Squad because it is a bunch of weirdos. And it's characters who were never ever going to get a spot in a movie under anybody else. I mean, you got David Dastmalchian plays a weird little freak,
Yeah.
which is my favorite thing in any movie. But you have Polka Dot Man, Calendar Man makes a cameo. You have Weasel, that guy whose arms come off.
Yeah, what
Just
was his name? He's so Nathan Fillion plays him, but I forgot his name. He's so funny. It's amazing.
but you have so many weird corners of the DC universe that come here, and it's really funny because you have all of these very comic book characters. I mean, the villain is a giant space starfish,
Yeah.
but it's one of the grittiest and most grounded of the DC films at the same time because it is people are dying, like there's real stakes to the things that are going on, even if it is this fantastical everyone's going to get mind controlled, which I think is also funny because that was the threat in the first Suicide Squad and you don't feel those stakes at all, but in this one there's actually like a degree of menace and tension there. And because that opening scene is such a bloodbath, you really feel like, oh, anybody in this movie can die at any time. And up until the finale, like that stays true. People are dying constantly from the go to the end of the line.
Yeah, I already kind of talked about this, but yeah, it's the one of my favorite scenes in like any superhero movie of like the past 10 years is the scene where Deadshot, is that his name? Deadshot?
Bloodsport,
Bloodsport.
Deadshot
And
is Will Smith.
that's right, that's right. Bloodsport and Peacemaker are just laying waste to that camp, and they find out that's like resistance allies like to them. It's such an amazing scene. And like you said, it's like it's crazy that a movie, yeah, where you got this giant like interdimensional starfish that's the villain for the third act of the movie, it manages to feel like the one that has like the most kind of like interesting stakes, and the one that the heroes feel really, yeah, grounded, and it's just really gritty and fun. I really like it.
So with that, you want to move into the number one spot.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to say is if Peacemaker doesn't count, my number two would have, or I guess this still would have been my number two. It would have been Birds of Prey, if I had to choose a movie. But my number one, which is really where I think I'm breaking the rules, but it's a DC property that came out in the past 10 years that isn't being continued into the future. So that's why I chose it, is the HBO series Watchmen, which
Mm.
is a sequel to Watchmen. Like I said, I think I'm cheating here, but any opportunity I can get to try to convince people to watch Watchmen, I'll take. I think that it's like one of the best continuations of anything ever. It might be my favorite piece of superhero media ever made. Like I think that it's about something really interesting and timely. It's got some great performances. There's great like twists and turns that the series takes. So I love it. If this doesn't count, then the Suicide Squad would be my number one. Birds of Prey would be my number two. Peacemaker would be my number two. Birds of Prey would be my number three, or Aquaman if no TV series counts. So Watchmen HBO series.
See, that's another thing that now that you put it out there, I'm like, yeah, I would agree. I also love
Okay.
Watchmen, just to plug it. Last week, I had the thought after seeing Gene Smart in Babylon, be like, hey, I should watch Watchmen again. And then
It's so
yesterday,
good.
HBO blew it out of existence. So
I think that it was
I
just
was
taken
fuming
off
at
for
that.
a second, but I think it's back on
It's back. All
now.
right,
Yeah, I
all right.
think so.
I'm less upset now then.
That's
But
one of the reasons why I put it at the top here, is because when I saw that, I was like, "Oh, I'm plugging Watchmen." So, yeah.
for my number one, I put Wonder Woman. I think
Okay.
this movie came out. This is only the fourth DCU movie, believe it or not. But it came out when people had absolutely no faith in the DC universe,
Yeah.
because this followed hot on the heels of the double whammy of Batman versus Superman and the Suicide Squad, and then came out right before Justice League. So this could not have come out at a worse time in the DC landscape. But it made almost $1 billion, and it was bold enough to ask the question, what if one of these movies was really good? And in my opinion, it was. It's not something. It really, none of these movies are anything that I'm aggressively like, yeah, I want to rewatch this. But I think Wonder Woman was a really strong movie. It was a good blockbuster debut for Patty Jenkins. It really sucks to see her kind of get dragged down in a lot of this. It was Wonder Woman 3 getting canceled that kind of announced the end of the DCEU. And there's a reason why I haven't mentioned Wonder Woman 1984, because it definitely does not sit near the top three. But I think this movie's really good. It really humanizes a more or less immortal, invulnerable character, which is something that I don't think this franchise ever really managed to do with Superman. But I think it's handled really well with Wonder Woman. I just like the World War I setting. It's cool. I love watching people duke it out in the trenches, and I think her walk into no man's land. There's a reason why it's in the Nicole Kidman AMC ad, because it is one of the most significant and I think one of the most powerful sequences that any of these movies has put together.
Yeah, I like this movie, but I think that I Gal Gadot just doesn't work for me as a lead actress. Like I don't I don't think she's a good actress. I think Pine is like he runs away with the movie, like he's really good in it. And I think the direction is super strong. So I like it, but I'm not quite strong. I do remember though that well, yeah, when this came out, it was like nobody expected anything of it, and it ended up being the biggest film of the summer of 2017. Like it was massive. Like when it dropped, it's like it's it was really impressive. Like how well this film did and how much it resonated and connected with people. And I agree with you. It was like in the scheme or the scope of the DCEU, which was up till that point a huge disappointment. This film was like a breath of fresh air for sure.
Yeah, and kind of getting a head start on the next thing we wanted to dive into. I feel like Wonder Woman stands out because it was the only truly female led DCU movie that didn't come out in the pandemic. And so I feel like they learned all the wrong lessons because, Wonder Woman was this big success and they, still had a 3 year jump on Marvel before Marvel did anything female centric, unless you count that one scene in Endgame. But they, they put Birds of Prey into production, Wonder Woman 1984 into production. Those both came out. I mean, Birds of Prey literally with the pandemic. Like the
Yeah.
pandemic came out a weekend before Birds of Prey and really
Hmm.
destroyed that at the box office. And then Wonder Woman 1984 was, in that wave of everything's going to debut on Max. Don't worry about going to the
Hmm.
theaters. And so I feel like they pulled the plug, and I think we saw that with Batgirl, where they were like, "Yeah, The Flash. This is definitely a movie we want to, spend 200 million more on to finish and promote." But no, Batgirl's gonna destroy the company, and I feel like they started to learn interesting lessons from Wonder Woman, and then absolutely forgot them.
Yeah. Man, it's interesting that you bring like say put it that way because I guess I totally had forgotten that Captain Marvel really was like the first big MCU movie. So yeah, it's like that. I feel like with movies like Wonder Woman being like I said, like the biggest movie of summer 2017, and then like Barbie this year being the biggest film of summer 2023. Like people often kind of undervalue, I think, female audiences and how much they're willing to show up when like you when you make something that's good and aimed at them. So yeah, it's interesting. If we're talking about like the kind of question of like what has been learned from this entire process, like I think that having a person like James Gunn at the helm in like 5 years ago would have filled me with so much hope towards this. But at this point, I'm honestly a lot more just kind of like I want him to do other things, like better things with his time as a filmmaker. Like I really like him as a filmmaker, and I'd way rather get more James Gunn stuff that's outside of what seems to be a genre that might be like we might be watching it slow death in real time. You know what I mean? Like it's I just feel like especially with somebody like David Zaslav at the helm of Warner Brothers, and we've seen like you brought up Batman or Batgirl, that he just like shelved the movie, and we're never the probably gonna ever see that movie. It might not ever see the light of day. Um, it just it seems to me that it's weird because I want to say, oh, you got James Gunn there, and he's going to be much more in the filmmaker's corner, you know, when they're making these movies and giving them their vision and all that, just because he values that type of stuff so much. But then you have this like leech at the head of Warner Brothers, who I think is gonna like it's like one step forward, two steps back, is how it feels to me. So I don't know, like it's interesting thinking of how this new era of DC is gonna go, because I do think there will be more coherence, and I think ultimately the movies are gonna be better, but I also don't know if audiences are gonna be showing up to them anymore. Like it's just really, we're in a really uncertain period, I feel like.
Yeah, and I feel like DC, just as a movie studio, not that DC itself is the studio, but they've never really had like a firm vision of what their franchises were going to be. So I mean, they had how much of a head start on Marvel? They were making Superman in 1978. And then, Batman came along naturally after that, and then they just kind of stagnated for a little while. And, of course, you got the Nolan series, which just kind of took the world by storm. And, you had a couple offshoots that never really took off to the same acclaim. And then, Marvel, who had pretty much been down and out, they had made a lot of movies that people really didn't like. Spider Man was going strong. The X Men were every other movie going strong. And then the MCU kind of came out of nowhere, took all these B-listers and turned it into, I mean, the event of the summer from 2012 really until this year. Like the Marvel movie of the summer was the event of the summer. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think you can see right out of the gate, with Man of Steel, I talked about how it feels like they really wanted Christian Bale to somehow be incorporated into this because there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of like imagery from the Dark Knight trilogy in there. I mean, like the Wayne Enterprises logo and all that's all the same. And even at the time, there were like rumors swirling around. Everyone loves that bad Photoshop of Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Nightwing. Um, but then, you can see where they kind of turned and were like, oh, we're going to make this actually, it's not an origin universe. We're going to make this a universe that's lived in. And the problem is they just kind of put it together with the same lived in care as they did with the Star Wars sequels, where you're like, here's this world. We're not going to explain how any of it came to be, but here's some things you recognize. And I think that's apparent in Batman versus Superman. It's apparent in Suicide Squad 2016. It's just kind of littered throughout where there was never a grand vision. So I think, yeah, it is cool that you have James Gunn stepping into kind of a Kevin Feige role where at least you have one person who's making these decisions and can kind of lay the course, but at the same time, it could not be put together by a more chaotic studio head
Yeah.
and studio at this time.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's so, like I said, it just feels like we're in a big question mark right now in terms of both the big superhero studios. Like it's just like James Gunn, if he had been walking into this gig like in 2017 or something, it'd be way more like, seem way more optimistic like about the time. Like it's just it's going to be interesting to see where we go from here.
Yeah, and I think there's enough hope, at least for his movies at the start, because you look at Guardians of the Galaxy 3 was Marvel's biggest hit, and if I'm not
Mm-hmm.
mistaken, it was Disney's biggest hit this year.
Yep,
And I
it
think
was.
if Barbie and Oppenheimer prove anything, it's that there are still people who will latch on to a director and be like, they are making this, I'm going to go see it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think Superman Legacy is going to be pretty pivotal. I think it's going to be banking on James Gunn more than it's going to bank on Superman.
Yeah,
And I think that's what this universe needs, and that's ultimately what the earlier Marvel movies were doing. Is you were banking on Favreau. I mean, Kenneth Branagh directed Thor, which is I think a pretty
crazy.
big deal. Yeah, and I mean even
Crazy.
even Joss Whedon had a lot of credit at the time. Like you were banking on the people making the movie, and even you look at the Russo brothers. Say what you will about their work since then, but they were the guys who directed the paintball episodes of Community, which were the
Mm-hmm.
biggest deal on TV at the time. And
Yep.
so I think if they can kind of keep that in mind and bank more on the artists than the properties, I think there's hope. But if it continues to be like, well, we need to rush this character out because we own them, then I think we're going to be in the same spot in 5 years.
Yeah. I think that what it comes down to is that Superman Legacy is going to have to be an awesome movie. Like it's have to be really, really good to get people, I think, back into the zone with this, because people will show up for a Superman movie. Like it's gonna happen, especially because I think James Gunn's gonna nail the tone. But it's like, will they keep showing up after that? And it's just, people showed up for Ant-Man, in 2015, which is an obscure character, but that Marvel was on top of the world at the time, so it's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, and I think at least from what we've seen so far, it's going to be a much different Superman movie. It's not going to be
Hmm.
here's Superman and all his human friends. It's here's Superman and all these weirdos. Also, you have people who are recognizable enough, and some of the leads. I am beyond excited that Rachel Brosnahan is going to be Lois Lane. I think that's phenomenal. I will watch Midge Maisel wipe the floor with Clark Kent and Lex Luthor all day. And I think Nicholas Holt, who also plays a lot of weirdos, I think him as Lex Luthor is going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, I have a lot of hope in James Gunn. So with that, let's jump into some winners and losers. So for this part, we don't necessarily want to talk about the movies themselves, but I want to talk about who kind of walked away from this winning and who really walked away from it losing. So I'll start. One of the biggest winners I think in this whole franchise is Ben Affleck. So if you take yourself back a long time ago to the year 2013, 2014 was when he was announced as being cast. People pretty much hated Ben Affleck, and it was
Yeah.
because of Daredevil. Last week I watched Surviving Christmas, which is a comedy he did with James Gandolfini in like 2003, and it made me hate Ben Affleck a little bit. And I was like, okay, like he was not a popular guy when this was announced. People kind of went nuts. They're like, "Are you kidding me? You're gonna make like this pretty boy? He's gonna be Bruce Wayne." Having to follow the most popular Bruce Wayne of all time. But for better or worse, I think these movies pretty well redeemed him. Like people love Ben Affleck right now, and I think he's had a more interesting career this side of the DCEU than he has before it. And he has, I mean, he was in Good Will Hunting. He has some pretty good movies before it. But I think you look at something that came out this year, like Air, which I absolutely love.
Yeah.
I think this universe redeemed him, and I think his time as Batman, even though it doesn't seem like something he's ever really been, too enthusiastic about after the debut. I think it absolutely did wonders for what audiences think of him.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting like take. I think the real winner here is Ben Affleck's public image, like in terms of Batman, because I don't know how much he enjoyed making the movies. Like we've seen all the memes. Like it seems like Ben Affleck has a lot of really he seems to constantly be having an existential spiral from the look of just how he looks. But I don't know. I think it's interesting because I was not on the wave of people who was hating on Ben Affleck when he was cast, but I remember it well. Because he was coming off of like The Town, which is a good movie in my opinion. He was coming off of a Best Picture win from Argo, and it just like seemed like Ben Affleck to me, somebody who was like more a little more into film, I guess, than most people. He was like kind of on top of the world at that point, but for the people who kind of gave up on Ben Affleck, which rightfully so. He was in like Jiggly and Daredevil, like you said, and like Jersey Girl, all these like movies where it's just like, oh God, like not this guy. Pearl Harbor, like it makes sense why people were so just. So I was pretty curious to see his take as Batman. And even though I was disappointed in the movies, I thought he was solid as Batman. And like you said, it turned public opinion on him. Everyone seems to really have responded well to his performance as Batman. So I'd agree. Like overall, Ben Affleck is like a quote unquote winner, or more so, in my opinion, Ben Affleck's public image is what is the real winner.
Well, I'm glad we agree that Ben Affleck is cool. But if you want to head into your first winner for the DCEU and who kind of walked away from this with a big dub.
So my first pick for a winner, I'll start with actually this one, the Snyder Army. They're winners here. because there was a point in time. I think what people don't really remember is that the conversation around the Snyder Cut was that it was this complete thing that existed, that it was like just hiding underground somewhere or something, according to these people. They were like, it's completely finished. Warner Brothers is hiding it from us, the quote unquote true fans, and we are entitled to and deserve it. Like, I'm sure there was somewhere like somebody planning some type of a heist that they were going to go try to break into Warner Brothers to find the Snyder Cut, which of course did not exist because then Zack Snyder came and was given the resources to make his cut of Justice League. Um, but yeah, the Snyder Army, they won that battle. Like everybody would like shit on the Snyder Army consistently. It would be like, oh, you guys are lunatics, you guys are a joke, move on with your life. And who had the last laugh? They probably all own it on 4K now, it's just wild. So I think I would consider them a winner in the case.
Yeah, it was funny because the announcement of the Snyder Cut proved that the Snyder Cut didn't exist. Because, like
Yeah.
you said, it was this mysterious like secret thing that was sitting in a vault in Area 51, and all we had to
Yeah.
do was harass Walter Hamada enough, and it would like come, it would crawl out of the hollow earth like Godzilla.
Hmm.
But then yeah, it turned out it wasn't a real thing, and then they proved that if you harass studio executives enough over the internet, you can eventually get your way. And I think all the bots were also winners. This was, kind of riding the wave of the Alita army. But I mean, The
Hmm.
Flash won the first honorary Oscar in
Yeah.
the Snyder Cut for The Flash entering the Speed Force was the most popular scene. I think, yeah, lots of real and fake winners in the Snyder army.
Yeah.
I think for me, the other big winner out of the DCEU is Henry Cavill. And I think what I really like about Henry Cavill and is he occupies what I like to call the Ruffalo space, because if you look at Mark Ruffalo, he's in the MCU. He's been around since 2012, but he really only has to show up like every 3 or 4 years. So he's playing a popular enough character that he's getting millions of dollars to do it, but he's not actually having to put in work most of the time because
Hmm.
he's an add-on in other people's movies. And so he's got all this time to go do more interesting side projects that put Mark Ruffalo out there, which is why he's currently running, post Endgame, and the others are just kind of walking, with the exception of Downey, who just recently blew up again. But I think Henry Cavill was in that position for the DCEU, which I think is kind of funny because he started it. It was supposed to be based around him,
Yeah.
and you can see that Man of Steel, it made a decent amount of money, but it was pretty mixed reviews. I mean, Superman got his ass beaten by Iron Man 3 that year, which I think is really funny. But then Henry Cavill is kind of in that position where the only other movie where he's the real lead is Batman versus Superman. That came out in 2015, and then he's just free to do all of these other interesting projects, but he's still getting paid his superhero money for showing up in Justice League and cameoing in Black Adam and all these other things. But
Hmm.
it really freed him up to do movies that I really like Man from Uncle, Mission Impossible, Fallout. You even look at
Sure.
Argyle coming up, and I think the DCEU proved that Henry Cavill could be a leading man, and I think The Witcher has continued to prove that. But I think he's a leading man who is smart enough to take supporting roles, and
Hmm.
so he shows up and he's a good heavy in Mission Impossible, or he's playing a side character with a weird hairdo in Argyle.
Yeah.
But because he is still a leading man, like he's recognizable, and I think in and of himself he has enough draw that his career's doing fine, which not everybody in these franchises can say.
Hmm. That's interesting that you list him as a winner. I would honestly almost list Henry Cavill as a loser in the scope of the DCEU, but when you frame it that way, I think it does make more sense to call him a winner. Just with the whole how it kind of wrapped up for him is where I kind of like land more towards, oh, he lost his Witcher gig, he lost his Superman gig, all this, it seems like he kind of got screwed over by it all. But like you said, he has been able to be in some, cool projects like Mission Impossible Fallout and the Man from Uncle. And yeah, I haven't watched The Witcher, but I've heard the people who like it really like it. And so yeah, it's interesting. I think I could look at it from both directions, and it's like it it fascinating to think about that. Like him compared to like Affleck, who it seemed like Affleck was kind of like done with this. He was kind of like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. And then Henry Cavill, who you have someone who's like, he was just getting ready to hop back into it. So
Yeah, and
it's
I think it's interesting if you compare him to like an MCU counterpart like Chris Evans, who is playing another beefed up, patriotic Superboy,
mhm.
from around the same set of years. And you look at Chris Evans' career post Endgame, he had Knives Out, which was hit right away, and then it's just a lot of movies that get lost on Netflix. And I think because he was in that position, yeah, he was more successful within the universe, but the body of work that says, "Hey, I can do all these other things," wasn't there. Whereas Henry Cavill, I agree with putting him as a loser within the DCEU because yeah, he was kind of the face and got it all taken away from him. But I think it put him in a position where he could prove that he could do all these other things and be all these other roles. And so now that we're outside of it, people are like, yeah, you can be Sherlock Holmes with Millie Bobby Brown, and you can, show up and be in a Matthew Vaughn film, and who knows what else he can do next.
This is like the perfect segue into my next winner, Ezra Miller. So there was a point in time, kind of like we were just talking about with the Snyder Cut, where what the conversation was around the Snyder Cut. There was a point in time where the chances of you being held hostage by Ezra Miller were not 0%. Like this person was on a crime spree across the United States. It seemed like Bonnie and Clyde style, and still had the Flash come out despite all of this crazy stuff that went on surrounding Ezra Miller. And I think that constitutes Ezra Miller as a winner in this situation, because with Batgirl getting shelved by David Zaslav, we have a situation where a movie where you have a very unappealing leading star with Ezra Miller is a film that still gets released. And so I would say that I count that as a win for old Ezra, where they were a leading actor in a huge, massive tentpole summer release that obviously bombed horribly. However, still it came out, and the Batgirl didn't. So I would say that's where I stand on that one.
I think, yeah, at some point after Perks of Being a Wallflower, Warner Brothers decided this kid is our future, and they made him integral to the Crimes of Grindelwald series, the Newt Scamander series, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
It's about a different person every time, but they made him an integral
yeah.
part, brought him back from the dead. Those movies all flopped. They did the same thing with the Flash in Justice League, especially in the Snyder Cut. He was a lot more important, and then again in the Flash, and yeah, it seems like no matter what he did, he was still gonna hit the publicity, which is kind of
It's
insane.
crazy. Yeah, it's pretty wild.
I think, yeah, I think those are some big winners. I think Margot Robbie's a pretty moderate winner. I think she would have won regardless of the DCU.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
I mean, she was already basically everything since Wolf of Wall Street she's touched has worked out for her. You can,
Yep.
Birds of Prey and The Suicide Squad didn't make as much money, but they still got a lot of attention. But I think it couldn't have hurt her publicity. But I think if you eliminated the DCU from existence, I think we would still be
She'd be
sitting
fine.
on,
Yeah.
yeah, she'd be in the exact same spot in life, sitting on top
Mm-hmm.
of the mountains of cash from Barbie.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. That's the thing, is like Margot Robbie has proven herself to be a very like she seems like a very intelligent and savvy person. And it's like, even like you said, Birds of Prey and Suicide Squad, they weren't as financially successful as they had hoped for. However, the conversation around her in those movies is people generally think she's one of the best parts of the movie. So it's, I think that she, like you said, that she's unimpeachably a winner when it comes to the DCEU.
Yeah, and I think ultimately the DCEU obviously didn't work out, but I think it was important that we had this Burger King in the midst of the McDonald's empire over at Marvel, because at least there was some counter programming. There was a little
Mm-hmm.
bit of option, and over time, this franchise tried to morph itself more like the Marvel films, but at least there was something different. And, hopefully now that Marvel's kind of losing its grip on, dominating, really Disney in general is losing its grip on dominating everything. Hopefully it can, kind of be more of a Wendy's and less of a Burger King in this new era.
um, can I quickly say my two losers, just because I'm really pleased with these. So the losers of the DCEU for me are Michael Shannon is my first one. The poor guy that he seemed miserable in the Flash, like didn't want to be there, but probably took his beach house and was just like, okay, like I'll be there for 2 days. Like you have to shoot around me while like I'll take a lunch break and be there, or whatever. But and then the other loser I would say is the rest of us, everyone else on the planet. So those are my losers. Did you have any losers?
Yeah, I think Michael Shannon's up there. But
Yeah.
he's one of those like Tommy Lee Jones, Sean Connery types who, if they don't like their movie, they're not going to hide it at all.
Oh yeah.
And like Hugo Weaving, like the kings of just absolutely hating everything they've ever done.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at least he's proud of it. And even I listened to he was on Armchair Expert pretty soon after the Flash came out. He was like, I didn't really care. I didn't have to do a whole lot. And they were like,
hmm
we'll pay you money. Just show up, say like a line over 3 days, and then you're good to go.
Exactly. He got to buy like a beach house, I'm sure, or something. He got to buy a new boat or there's something along those lines. Like he's not hurting any, but just kind of didn't get to do a take shelter or a mud or whatever.
Yeah, and I think my other big winner, and I love to talk about him, is David Dismalchian. He just he plays weird little guys. He started playing them in The Dark Knight. He played one in this DC universe. He'll probably play another weird little guy in the next one. And I think the Suicide Squad, he kind of sits in the Margot Robbie boat, where yeah, it didn't make a ton of money, but people really liked Polka Dot
Yep.
Man, and I
Yep.
mean he's a busy actor. He was in Oppenheimer in a pretty significant role. He was in Last Voyage of the
That's
Demeter,
right.
give or take. He's had busy years since then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that guy's always working. Like I always love whenever he shows up. He showed up in the Boogeyman too
Yeah,
recently. So yeah, he's a really good like just I love how James Gunn gave him like the chance as just like this small consistent character actor to play this like kind of bigger role in a tempo movie. It's fun. So yeah, I'd agree. He's a winner.
so, as we kind of wrap it up, we'll do some real quick. Do you have any favorite moments from the DCEU?
I do. My favorite moment from the DCEU was when the hierarchy of power in the DCEU shifted. That's probably my favorite DCEU moment. Um, yeah,
That might be the best moment ever. Like not just in
yeah,
the DC universe, in any universe.
called his shot, man. He called it. Did he hit it? No, but he called it.
But he aimed at something, and that's really what
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I this franchise is mostly hit and miss for me. I think my
hmm
absolute favorite moment out of the entire thing though is Ewan McGregor as Black Mask, just because he is absolutely going for it. And
Yeah.
particularly his death, I think, is the funniest way any of these big bads has been killed off. where he just gets blown in half and it's so gory and bloody. Just
Yeah.
loved it. He was just this super flamboyant version of the character who's usually just like straight up Italian mobster, and it was a lot of fun. Ewan was having a lot of fun. He met his wife on that movie, or at least worked with her on
Oh,
that movie, so he's a winner in the DCEU.
yeah.
It's more interesting than Obi-Wan, so
Yeah, for real. Like he's probably the most memorable villain of the whole DCEU in my opinion. I think he's great like you. So, yeah, that's a good moment. No doubt. Another one of the favorite moments that I listed was when I was walking out of the theater after The Flash ended, and I kind of was just thinking while I was walking in my car about how the reactions coming out of CinemaCon were people saying this is one of the best superhero movies ever made.
yeah, I remember like putting my review together, and I'm in a Facebook group that loves movies, and there's a lot of people who were like raving about it. So I put my review up on Letterboxd, and one of the guys was like, "Post this in the group, I dare you." And I was like, "I don't want to get excommunicated. I'm just gonna keep this one to myself."
Yeah, uh, that was I can't believe the hype coming out of the CinemaCon screening was really high on that movie. Like, and then it kind of started to go down as it got closer to release. But yeah, I just thought of that when I was leaving the theater.
Just
Um,
the double
Go ahead.
whammy of Michael Keaton following up his Vulture cameo in Morbius with his glorified Batman cameo in The Flash is just pretty brutal.
Yeah, it's a big oof. Michael Keaton deserves a lot better than that. Like, we got to get him away from these. Like, I'm hoping Beetlejuice 2 works out for him. We'll see.
Well, DCEU, it's been a ride. Aquaman 2, Aquaman the Lost Kingdom comes out here in a few weeks, and that's pretty much it. I'll be surprised because people love Aquaman and the first one way more money than anyone expected, but
Hmm.
I don't see this one crossing a billion. I
There's no way.
Yeah,
There's absolutely no way. Like, if it makes $1 billion, that I have completely lost all touch with the human race and what people want to see. Like it just seemed, especially if Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which it seemed like there was more hype around, didn't hit 1 billion. There's no way that Aquaman's gonna hit 1 billion. That's crazy.
yeah. I just don't see it happening, and I think it's a perfect ending to the DCEU for them to announce that the thing is ending a year and a
Yeah.
half and three movies before it actually ends. And I think we've watched it lip. It's like Will Ferrell's character in Austin Powers, where he gets shot and he's like screaming for help, and then they throw him into a lava pit, and then they shoot him again. That's that's about as smooth as the DCEU's final days have been.
Yeah, it really is gonna feel like going to a funeral for those of us unfortunate souls who are gonna go and watch Aquaman, The Lost Kingdom. It just ugh, it's I agree. It's been a long illness that's getting snuffed out. It's truly one of the franchises of all time in cinema.
These are movies that have existed.
Yep.
They might continue to exist. The state of Warner Brothers, I don't know. There's a good chance they all just get wiped off the face of the earth here in a few
Yep.
weeks. But it's been fun. It's been a good time talking DC with you, Spencer. We'll be back soon talking about more movies. Living on the brighter side of the year 2023, away from DC. Maybe someday we'll even be able to do an RIP MCU pod. Who knows?
It might be just around the corner. Who knows? Yeah.
The era of the DCEU is ending, but the universe of Spider-Man owned by Sony characters has just begun. So with that, make sure to check us out online at moviebabble.com, and we'll talk to you next time.